Good morning, friends. I am Swapnil and you mostly welcome in our channel, YouTube channel. So today we will discuss in the fifth stop English literature about the age of Pope, which timeline is 1700 to 1750. The age of Pope is also called Augustan age or classical age. Here, Augustan age stands for any period of polished manners, high culture, and great literary attainments, which may be favorably compared with the age of the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar, during which Virgil, Ovid, Horace, and other great poets lived and wrote. Ahead, we can discuss about this age that this age is just as the reign of Augustus, which is known as the classic and the golden age of Rome. In the same way, the age of Queen Anne is called Augustan age in the history of English literature. Actually, it was the age of great writers in prose writing, in poetry writing, and playwriting. And here were born so many great literary figures in this era, such as Joseph Addison, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Oliver Goldsmith, Dr. Johnson, Burke, Gibbon, and Alexander Pope. But here also happen some historical events which are so much prominent. Here happened there was the rise of the political parties such as Whig and Tory. Whig represents low churchman and Tory represents high churchman. There was occurred the war which is called the Foreign War, which occurred in 1701, and here we find the event Peace of Utrecht in 1713. For that, there was also took place the Spanish succession, and there we find there was established the coffee houses also. So here I want to continue. What are the coffee houses? Actually, in the 17th century, we find this century witnessed the establishment of coffee houses in the country England, because this rapid growth of the coffee houses was largely due to the flourishing of trade of the East India Company. Here, drinking coffee and tea and spending time in the coffee houses continued to be the fashion in the successive generations also. At the peak of their popularity, there were not less than 3,000 coffee houses in London city, alone in London city. But in cities and towns, the coffee houses were the centers of social life. And we find that literary men had their own coffee houses. Literary personalities established their own coffee houses. And here, matters of common interest were hostily discussed in these coffee houses. These coffee houses were truly the schools of wit, criticism, and dialectics. But there was one school, one movement, that is one club, we can say that. It is a scribblers club. This club is an association of which Jonathan Swift, Dr. Arbuthnot, Parnell, Alexander Pope, and Gay. These were the members of this club. And the Earl of Oxford, whose name is Harley, also was a regularly invited associated member for this Scribblers Club. This group appears to have met from January to July 1714, and this group's aim Our object was to ridicule all the false tests in learning, but nothing was produced under the name of Martinus Scriblerus for some years actually. So here in this era, we find there were some prose writers, and at the beginning we will discuss about Jonathan Swift, whose lifetime was 1667 to 1745. Talking about Jonathan Swift, he was the greatest English satirist, and he was a relative of John Dryden. Means he was a cousin of John Dryden. Here, John Dryden says about Jonathan Swift that cousin Swift, you will never be a poet. There is a literary work by Jonathan Swift, which title is Cadenus and Vanessa. Actually, it is a poetry written in octosyllabic couplet. And in this poem, we find the Esther van Homrie. She fell. Esther van Homrie. It is the poem about Esther van Homrie. And this, the personality Esther van Homrie fell deeply in love with Jonathan Swift. And this poem has written. There was another great literary work written by Jonathan Swift. Its title is The Battle of the Book, which appeared in 1704. The full title of The Battle of the Books is uh, a full and true account of the battle fought last Friday between the ancient and the modern books in St. James' Library. This work is a prose satire. When Swift was residing with Sir William Temple, at that time, this work was created. The battle originates from a request by the moderns that the ancients shall evacuate the higher of the two peaks of Parnassus, which they have previously occupied. Here we find the spider is like the moderns, and the bees is like the ancients. These are some of the important points. We find that the ancients, under the patronage of Pallas, are led by Homer, Pindar, Euclid, Aristotle, and Plato, and with Sir William Temple also commanding the allies. And these were the people, yes, who uh, who were consisted in the group of ancient, yes, and in the group of moderns we find John Milton, John Dryden, Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Scotus, and others people, and they were with the support of Momus, MOMUS, and the malignant deity criticism, and that's why this work is called the first noteworthy book. There was another literary work, A Tale of a Tube, which appeared 1704, and it is the work written by Jonathan Swift. It is his celebrated satire on corruptions in religion and learning, and this is this Jonathan Swift's best work. It is a religious allegory. In this book, the author proceeds to tell the story of a father who leaves as a legacy to his three sons. These three sons are Peter, Martin, and Jack. And here we find with fire, dear friends, the sons gradually disobey the injunction, finding excuses for adding shoulder knots or gold lace according to the prevailing fashion. Here, finally, Martin and Jack quarrel with the arrogant Peter, then with each other and separate. The satire is directed with especial vigor against Peter, his bulls, and dispensations, and the doctrine of transubstantiation. Ahead, we find the political tracts also written by Jonathan Swift. And here we find the conduct of the allies, some remarks on the barrier treaty, the republic spirit of the Whigs. Yes. So these are some important political tracts written by Jonathan Swift. And these tracts were written for the examiner. Yes. And the Examiner, you know very well, it is a journal. It is actually Tory journal. Yes, there were part. There were two parties, you know very well, Whig party and Tory party. So the journal, the Examiner, belonged to the Tory party. Here was another work by Jonathan Swift, that was is a journal to Stella, and this work is an informal private logbook. It is a series of intimate letters, and this work is written to Esther Johnson and her companion Rebecca Dingley. And there was a literary work, the Drapier's Letters, and this Drapier's Letter is a series of pamphlet. And there was another greatest work by Jonathan Swift that is called Gulliver's Travels. This work was published in 1726. It is a satire, and here we find the travels into several remote nations of the world by Lemuel Gulliver. And here we find that it is the longest and the most famous book in the history of English literature. Thackeray says it is a furious, ragging obscene. Stephen says it is a painful and repulsive. And this work, Gulliver's Travels, resembles its fellow allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress. It means both Gulliver's Travels and The Pilgrim's Progress are the allegories. There's we find there are some other works, a voyage to the Humnims. After that, a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burden to their parents. For that, predictions for the ensuing year 1708 by Isaac Bickerstaff. After that, it discourse of the contest and dissensions between the nobles and the commons in Athens and Rome. This was written with the reference to the impeachment of the Whig laws. There was another work, Argument Against Abolishing Christianity. It is the series of pamphlets on church questions. There was another work, later concerning the sacramental tests. It is an attack on the Irish Presbyterians. And there was another work, The Importance of the Guardian Considered and the Public Spirit of the Whigs. There is the next writer, who is also significant personality in the history of English literature, whose name is Joseph Addison. So, talking about Joseph Addison, Addison was a prominent member of the Kit Kat Club, and he satirized by Alexander Pope in the character of Atticus. Here was Addison's first work, which title is The Campaign. It is a poem. The campaign is a poem, and the campaign is written in heroic couplet. It is written in rhymed gadget, and especially it is written in celebration of the victory of Blenheim. There was another work by Joseph Addison. That title is Cato. Cato is a drama. It is a tragedy. It is a neoclassical tragedy, and it wrote in blank verse. And Cato deals with the death of Cato, the Republican. And here Dr. Johnson says, yes, Cato is rather a poem in dialogue than a drama. Yes, it's very nice. There was a next work by Addison, Rosamond. Rosamond is an opera. There was another work, that one, The Drummer. The Drummer is a prose comedy. Another work, The Vision of Misa. Next work was Public Credit. Public Credit is a political allegory. There is next one point is The Spectator. Actually, The Spectator is a periodical, and The Spectator is started by Steele and Joseph Addison in March 1711. Keep in mind. There is a next one of the personality in the history of English literature, Sir Richard Steele. Talking about Richard Steele, he wrote The Christian Hero. Its full title is An Argument Proving That No Principles but those of religion are sufficient to make a great man, and the Christian hero is a treatise. And there are now some prose comedies written in this era. The Funeral, its subtitle is Grips a la Mode. It is a comedy. Next one is the lying lover, the lying lover. After that, the next one, the tender husband. Next one, the conscious lovers. The conscious lovers is the last comedy, and it is based on the Andrea of Tennis. Uh, Stille started the Tattler. It is also journal, the Tattler in 1709, and the Tattler is a periodical. It is a first. It firstly issue appeared on 12 April 1709. It appeared thrice or three times weekly until 2nd January 1711. And we find Spectator. Yes, Spectator by Steele. Spectator is a periodical conducted by Richard Steele and Joseph Addison from 1st March 1711 to 6 December 1712. Was revived by Addison in 1714 when 18 numbers were issued, and Spectator were appeared daily actually. And for Spectator there were principal contributors Joseph Addison and Sir Richard Steele, and there are other contributors also, such as Alexander Pope, T.K.L. Bajel, A. Philip, Dane, and Lady M.W. Montague. Now there were other periodicals such as The Guardian. The Guardian appeared firstly in March 1713. The Guardian professed at the outset to abstain from political questions. Addison contributed 51 papers to it. Other contributors, such as Berkeley, Alexander Pope, Gay, contributed very artistically for this periodical, and the Guardian came to an abrupt end in October 1713. There was another periodical, The Englishman, which is a more political paper. Another one, The Reader, The Plebeian, which is a political periodical. The Crisis is a pamphlet, and the Crisis wrote in favor of the Hanoverian succession. And there was the next greatest writer, Daniel Defoe. And Daniel Defoe was the first true novelist. He was master of plain prose. He wrote the work, an essay upon projects. There was another work, The True Born Englishman. Actually, it is written for political writing. It is an immensely popular satirical poem attacking the prejudice against a king of foreign birth and his Dutch friends. There was next one, The Shortest Way with Dissenters is a notorious pamphlet, and it is also belong to political writing. There ahead we find a hymn to the pillory is a mock Pindaric ode, and we find that the political tracts and pamphlets appear in this era, such as the Review, the Tatler, and the Spectator. Right, talking about the fiction by mm, Daniel Defoe. The first one is The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, which appeared in 1719. It is based on the experience of Alexander Selkirk. It is a romance. It is the first English novel. It is considered the first English novel in the history of English literature. And here, Rousseau in Emily recommended it as the first book that should be studied by a growing boy. St. Coleridge praised Defoe's evocation of the universal man. And ahead we find Karl Marx in Das Kapital use it to illustrate economic theory in action. These are the comments on the Robinson Crusoe. And in the rise of the novel and other essays, Ian Watt provides one of the most controversial modern interpretation relating Crusoe's predicament to the rise of bourgeois individualism, division of labor, and social and spiritual alienation. Robin's sonnets, also it is also called Robin's sonnets. These are the work, The Adventures of Philip Quarrel. The Adventures of Philip Quirrell is an adventure story. It is originally published as The Hermit by Edward Dorrington, but it attributed to Peter Langeville and Alexander Bicknell. And actually, it is a derivative of Robinson Crusoe. It describes Quirrell's 50 years of solitude and suffering on a South Sea island. There is another work, The Life and Adventures of Peter Wilkins, a Cornish man. It is a romance by Paltok, and this work was much admired in the Romantic period by Robert Southey, S.T. Coleridge, P.B. Shelley, Charles Lamb, and Sir Walter Scott. There was another work, The Swiss Family Robinson. It is the romance of a family wrecked on a desert island. Iceland. It is written in German language, especially, and we find here is John Davis Vass, who is a Swiss pastor, and this work was firstly published in two parts in Zurich in 1812 to 13, and this work is the first English translation, which was a year later. There was another text that is the the further adventures of Robinson Crusoe, which appeared in 1719. Uh, uh, in it, with Friday, he revisits his Iceland and is attacked by a fleet of canoes on his departure and loses Friday in the encounter. There is another work, Serious Reflections of Robinson Crusoe, with his vision of Anglic word. Actually, it is a manual of pity than a work of fiction, and it appeared in 1720. Right, we find Duncan Campbell, Memoirs of a Cavalier. Uh, both are a very good work. Memoirs of the Cavalier is a historical romance. Next one, Adventures of Captain Singleton is a romance of adventure. Uh, the Fortunes and Misfortunes of the famous Moll Flanders is a romance. After that, we find a Journal of the Plague Year is a historical fiction. And in a Journal of the Plague Year, some scenes appear to have been borrowed from Decker's The Wonderful Year. And here Harriet says the work of an epic grandeur, means a Journal of the Plague Year is a work an epic grandeur as well as heartbreaking familiarity. Right, there is a work, The History of Remarkable Life of Colonel Jack, commonly called Colonel Jack, and it is a romance of adventure. After that, there was A New Voyage Around the World, Roxana or the Fortunate Mistress. After that, Daniel Defoe's next, Mercator, Mercator. Mercator is a trade journal. And here are other works by Daniel Defoe. Last principal or important works are there. The Complete English Tradesman, Augusta Trims, and last one is A Plan of the English Commerce. There is the next writer, John Arbuthnot, and he is specially considered known for political writing. He is a physician to Queen Anne, and Dr. Johnson says John Arbuthnot was the most universal genius. And we had that John Arbuthnot wrote his first work, Prologue to the Satires, and Prologue to the Satires is one of his finest satirical epistles. And we find Memoirs of Martinus Scriblerus. Memoirs of Martinus Scriblerus is a satirical work. It is directed against false taste in learning. It is initiated by the Scriblerus Club, and the name Martin Scriblerus was occasionally used by Alexander Pope as a pseudonym and by Crabbe in some of his earlier poems. There is another work by John Arbuthnot, and that one is The History of John Bull. Yes, and this work ridicules the war uh, policy of the Whigs. It is a collection of pamphlets, and this work issued anonymously in 1712. We find it advocates the termination of the war with France. It included in Pope and Swift's miscellanies of 1727. It we find the art of political lying is next work by John Arbuthnot. It is a satiric pamphlet. And there is a next writer, Lord Bolingbroke. Actually, Lord Bolingbroke, also known Henry St. John, and he is a first discount. And especially Lord Bolingbroke was influenced Pope Alexander Pope. Yes, and his work is Letter to Sir William Wandham. After that, a letter on the spirit of the patriotism and the idea of a patriotic king. Right, there is a George Berkeley. Yes, and he wrote important work, The Principles of Human Knowledge, uh, which is a study of the human mind. After that, three dialogues between Hylas and Philonos, Alciphron or the Minute Philosopher. There is a next writer, Lady Mary Wortley Montague, who wrote important work which title is Letters. After that, the next writer is Earl of Shaftesbury, whose significant and famous work is Characteristic of Men, Manners, Opinions, and Times. The next personality is Francis Atterbury, who is one of the Pope's intimate associates. Next one is Colley Cibber, and Colley Cibber was the hero of the second version of Alexander Pope's literary work, which title is Dunciad. And we find Colley Cibber wrote the work Apology or Autobiography. And after that, talking about the age of Pope, yes, we will turn toward the greatest figure, the greatest soul, the greatest writer. There is not a word for that personality whose name is Alexander Pope. So we will continue about Alexander Pope. Talking about Alexander Pope, he is one of the greatest writer, poet especially, and his lifetime was 1688 to 1744. He was the greatest master of the classical school of poetry especially. And we find that this personality, this personality's words are so effective, we can say that, so positive. Yes, and there are some lines um, by the Alexander Pope. The proper study of mankind is man. True wit is what oft was thought, but never so well expressed. There was his work, which title is Pastoral. It is a very important work by Alexander Pope. After that, an essay on criticism, which appeared in 1711 in Heroic Couplets. And an essay on criticism is a didactic poem which published anonymously in 1711, and it begins with an exposition of the rules of taste and the authority to be attributed to the ancient writers on the subject. And in this book, the laws by which a critic should be guided are then discussed, and instances or examples are given of critics who have departed from them. There is another work by Alexander Pope, Messiah, which published in the periodical Spectator in May 1712. And Messiah is a sacred eclogue. It is embodied in verse the messianic prophecies of Isaiah. There is the next work by Alexander Pope, Windsor Forest. It is a pastoral. It is a topographical poem. It is a poem about celebrating the peace of Utrecht, Utrecht, and it combines description of landscape with historical, literary, and political reflections. There is the grand, greatest, famous, popular, marvelous work written by, composed by Alexander Pope. And the title of that literary work is The Rape of the Lock. which existed, which came to born in 1712. It is a great mock heroic poem. It is a brilliant poem in the history of English literature, and this poem wrote in two cantos, subsequently enlarged to five cantos, and thus it published in 1714. To that, this poem, The Rape of the Lock, published in Lintott's Miscellany in 1712 also. When Lord Pitre forcibly cut off a lock of Miss Arabella Fermore's hair, the incident gave rise to a quarrel between the families. And here Alexander Pope treated the subject in a playful mock heroic poem on the model of Boileau's Le Lutrin, Lutrin. And here Dr. Johnson says about this poem that the rape of the lock is the most attractive of all ludicrous compositions. This is the next work by Alexander Pope. That one is translation of Iliad and Odyssey. Yes, and from Fenton and Broom, discussed classical scholars that Pope's edition of Shakespeare, Theobald's Shakespeare restored. After that, we find the Dunciad written by Alexander Pope, which appeared anonymously in 1728. Again, the Dunciad was republished in 1742. And especially, the Dunciad was modeled on Macflecknoe, yes, written by John Dryden. And the Dunciad is a mock heroic satire, especially. There were some philosophical poems by Alexander Pope, such as To Lord Bathurst, of the use of riches, of the knowledge and character of men, of characters of women, an essay on man. An essay on man by Alexander Pope is a philosophical poem in heroic couplets. Actually, it was incomplete work, and it consists of four epistles addressed to Bolingbroke. Its objective is to vindicate the ways of God to man. This work deals with man's relations to the universe, to himself as an individual, to society, and to happiness. Stewart says an essay on man is the noblest specimen of philosophical poetry which our language affords. Dr. Johnson says it is never be a penury of knowledge and vulgarity of sentiments so happily disguised. So there were another works by Alexander Pope, moral essays. These moral essays were written under the influence of Lord Bolingbroke. We find four ethical poems in it, and Alexander Pope, the first, it included four epistles. Yes, first epistle addressed to Viscount Cobham. It deals with the knowledge and characters of men. Epistle second addressed to Martha Blount. It deals with the characters of women. Epistle third addressed to Lord Bathurst. It deals with the use of riches. Um, Epistle third contains the famous characters of the Man of Ross and Sir Balaam. Epistle 4 addressed to Lord Burlington. Epistle 4 originally subtitle of False Test. It deals with the same subject as uh, um, epistle third, means it deals with the use of riches. Epistle 4 gives instances of the tasteless use of wealth. There is another work by Alexander Pope, Imitations of Horace. So that epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is a prologue to the satires. It contains the famous portraits of Lord Hervey and Addison. Uh, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is one of the Pope's most brilliant pieces of irony and invective mingled with autobiography. Next work by Pope is Ode for Music on Saint Cecilia's Day. It is one of his rare attempts at lyric. After that, next, The Age of Pope There are some other poets who also contributed for the development of poetry in Augustan or classical era. First one was Matthew Prior, who is a poet actually, and here we find he wrote the work The Hind and the Panther, transfers to the story of the country and the city mouse, and it is the first long work in the history of English literature. And Matthew Prior wrote this work with the collaboration of Charles Magnew, Charles Montague, and in it he ridicules the Hind and the Panther by John Rodden. Yes. Next one, Alma. Next work is Alma, or the Progress of the Mind. It imitates Samuel Butler's Hudibras. It is a Hudibrastic dialogue ridiculing various systems of philosophy. There is a next work, Solomon on the Vanity of the World, uh, which is written in heroic couplet. And Solomon on the Vanity of the World is a long soliloquy. There were some short pieces in this era, such as the uh, Chameleon, the Thief, and the Cordelier to Chloe. There is the next writer, John Gay. Yes, John Gay is one of the greatest writers in this era, or the important writer in this era. He wrote his first work, The Fan, which is written in the mock heroic style, such as The Rape of the Lock. And ahead, the rural sports, which also composed in heroic couplets, and the rural sports resembles Alexander Pope's pastoral. It is on the model of his friends Alexander Pope's Windsor Morris. There is the next work, The Shepherd's Week, the What I Call It. The What I Call It is a pastoral farce and a satirical farce. There is the next work by John Gay, Trivia, Trivia, which subtitle is The Art of Walking the Streets of London. It is a poem in 3 books. Here, trivia means streets. Here, trivia means streets. Next work by Gay is Fables. After that, The Beggar's Opera, which is a play. It is the sequel. Sorry, its sequel is Polly. And next one is Black Eyed Susan. Is actually poem. It is a ballad. There is a next writer in this era, Edward Young. Edward Young wrote a play, Bussy Reese, which is a tragedy. The Universal Passion, which is a series of satires. The Last Day, so that the force of religion, which compose in heroic couplets. So that the love of fame. After that, the complaint or night thoughts on life, death, and immortality. The complaint wrote in blank verse. It was inspired by the death of his wife, and it is the younger's most celebrated poem. Next work is The Brothers, which is a tragedy. After that, Resignation is the last important poem. It also wrote with the preface to Mrs. Boscawen and appeared in 1762. Dr. Johnson says, but with all his defects, he was a man of genius. And there is a next writer, Sir Samuel Garth, who is a physician. He assisted Alexander Pope. He knighted when George first ascended the throne, and he wrote important work, The Dispensary. There was next writer, Lady Winchelsea. He wrote the work, The Spleen, The Prodigy, which is a Pindaric road, miscellany poem, a nocturnal reverie. Next writer was Ambrose Phillips. Ambrose Phillips is a friend of Alexander Pope. He wrote 3 tragedies. For example, The Distressed Mother. There was a next writer, Thomas Parnell, who wrote the work The Hermit. Hermit is one of the best work by Thomas Parnell, and he wrote this work in heroic couplets. Next writer, Alexander Ramsay. Alexander Ramsay is a local unofficial poet laureate. He wrote the work Lochaber No More, The Gentle Shepherd, which is a pastoral drama. After that, The Evergreen. After that, John Phillips. John Phillips wrote the work The Splendid Shilling, which is written in blank verse. Henry Muddiman, who wrote the work The Parliamentary Intelligencer, Mercurius Publicus, the London Gazette. Uh, the London Gazette is actually journal by Henry Muddiman. The periodicals. Uh, Gazeta is a periodical. It is the first periodical. Gazeta is the first periodical published in the Europe in 1536, and it published in Venice, especially. Uh, Gazeta is a first regular English journal. Was a weekly publication begun in 1622 by Thomas Archer and Nicholas Bohr. There was a Corantos also there, information of which gives information of foreign wars. But Corantos was banned in 1632. After that, Journals, Diurnalls. It prints home news, and here we concluded the age of Pope. We have discussed here age of Pope. So now I want to thank you so much. You listen very carefully the lecture. Thank you. See you. Stop.